Hello everyone, this is part 2 of What If Naruto Met Past Hinata, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. Enjoy. Hinata's stomach was now located somewhere around her knees. She didn't need Sakura to tell her that either, even though the woman was still examining her gingerly, her warm hands tilting her chin to look into her eyes with that funny-looking instrument. Any loss or blurring of your vision? Hinata's voice was lodged nicely in the very bottom of her tea, only surfacing as a weak whisper. No, ma'am. Sakura raised a cotton candy eyebrow and took another sideways glance at Naruto, who was pacing frantically outside the room. Sighing, she stepped back and looked at Hinata, concern lacing her features. Hinata, you don't have to call me ma'am. I'm only 22 for God's sakes. Hinata let her eyes dance to the floor, feeling rather embarrassed as Sakura turned around and rifled through some drawers and put away things on the counter. Hinata squeezed her hands together on the examination table and the pinkett continued with a tiny laugh. So Naruto kept going on about you bumping your head this morning. You two must have been busy last night. Hinata flushed fire red and blinked, still staring at the tiles, willing them to swallow them whole. Sakura turned around and noticed immediately, a coy smile gracing her features. Don't worry, I'm sure he's just exaggerating about the whole memory loss thing, he's such an idiot. Sakura put her hand on Hinata's head, feeling everywhere until she'd found the ginger spot from that morning's escapades. So, tell me why you come in here so early for. You look absolutely fine. Hinata breathed heavily. Sakura-san. I think that's something is wrong with me. Sakura stopped feeling Hinata's head and looked at the kunoichi severely. Hinata, I told you not to worry about that. It's just going to take time for you two. It's not like it'll never happen. She smiled warmly. I'm sure Naruto understands perfectly that it's not your fault. Hinata's brow furrowed in confusion. What? Am I sick? What isn't my fault? Sakura's smile dropped. Hinata, why have you been stuttering so much? You grew out of that years ago. And what do you mean, what? You've been having trouble for the last year. Hinata felt swells of worry in her chest. Trouble with what? She practically cried, as if maybe the secret could hold some kind of answer to the chaos she was in right now. Sakura stopped touching her altogether and her eyes narrowed in suspicion. Okay, just what is going on here? Naruto calls me at 10 in the morning when he should be at the tower going on about some kind of amnesia nonsense, and then you show up looking perfectly normal. That's just it. Hinata cried, staring at the woman who had been so beautiful. Hinata could barely talk to her. Don't remember anything. IIW woke up 22. woke up 5 years older. Sakura stared at Hinata very carefully, a very, very long silence enveloping the two before Sakura finally spoke, weighing her words heavily. You mean to say that you woke up 22 and went to bed 17? Is that really what you just told me? Hinata flushed, but nodded her head shamefully. No, it sounds insane. She mumbled, wiping away a few tears, but it's true. And I feel so overwhelmed. Her words disintegrated into tears as she held her hand to her face. Meanwhile, Sakura's medic intuition was clearly telling her that this was not just a story. The obvious distress of her patient, the reverting to old speech patterns, obvious unknowing of a very important issue that had been addressed only days ago. Sakura analyzed Hinata closely. Her behavior was like that of patients when they just wake up from anesthesia. She kept looking at her hands, looking at Sakura, then just looking at her hands again, eyes wide and clouded. It's not insane. I've heard of some crazier things around here. Quote. Hinata barely lifted her head, her hand dropping away to reveal eyes that were so frightened and so hopeless. Eyes she'd seen in the turbulent, emotional years of Hinata's youth. It was like looking at Hinata at 16, her heart breaking slowly under pressures and pains from her family and untold wants and needs she'd never allowed herself. Sakura put a hand on her shoulder. We'll figure it all out. She said softly, and Hinata's lips trembled as more tears leaked anyway, brushed hastily with the back of her hands. Thank you, she whispered in reply, but Sakura could hear the tones of not being totally convinced. I bet that idiot didn't even try to believe you, did he? He just let you run wild without even trying to help. At least he brought you here, now we can actually do something. Hinata blushed slightly and sniffed. I sort of thought he was an imposter, she said weakly, and Sakura looked at her sternly. Don't even think that way. None of this is your fault. You are the victim here, and should have been treated with respect. Hinata looked fearfully at the woman Sakura had become. She was still Pete, but she was just as fierce as ever with those beautiful pink tresses. She had traded her short locks for something a bit longer, resting just on her shoulders and halfway pulled back so that only a few bits touched her cheeks, framing the doll-like face. Her eyes were a flashing jade and they were very determined as she began moving about, pulling out files and forms. Hinata wondered how it was that one woman could make a simple white lab coat look so amazing. First things first, we'll need to get all the details of what you were doing before all of this on paper. That way we may get some kind of answer. Then we'll start a few diagnostics, just to see how your brain is managing and if it's just temporary or not. Then we'll go see about finding an answer to how to get you right again. Oh, she suddenly stopped and looked at Hinata with a great deal of sympathy. You probably have no idea what's going on here, do you? Well, we'll fix that. I'll get Ino over here and she'll tell you everything about anything you want to know. Sound okay? That way you won't be so lost. Hinata nodded weakly, feeling a little relieved for once. Even if it was Ino, and even if the facts might just be warped a little, she could use some explanations. Why yes. Thank you. Sakura smiled warmly and felt as though she was playing mother hen to a very lost little girl. We'll get it all sorted out. I make a point that failure is no option. This made the girl twitch with a smile and she nodded thankfully. Thank you. Sakura smiled and motioned for Hinata to get up off the table, and showed her to the door. Once it had opened, Naruto stared at them both, his expression hopeful. He strode briskly towards Hinata and crushed her in a hug. Hinata's heart was pounding through her chest, and her arms were stiffly held beside her as he nuzzled her in, spreading the smell of sun-warmed grass all throughout her body. With his arms still around her, he looked up at Sakura, his frame still a good means taller than her head tucked right under his chin. Is she all right now? Does she remember? Sakura rolled her eyes and used her clipboard to enthusiastically beat the man away from the statuesque woman. As he retreated, she put a protective arm in front of Hinata, guarding her. Naruto, this is no easy fix. She honestly is not 22. Just look at her and tell me she's who she was last night. Naruto looked worriedly at Hinata, walking a few steps closer. As he looked, Hinata's eyes stared into his, still blushing mad. Sakura looked away as pain filled his expression, her own heart constricting painfully. Why was it always Naruto? Oh Hinata, he murmured, and for a moment his hand twitched towards her, but her eyes widened in surprise and she flushed again. The hand quit moving and Naruto put on a masking smile. Don't worry Hinata, I won't let anything ever happen to you. I promised and I'm going to keep it. It doesn't matter how old you are, you're still Hinata. He looked at Sakura then, and Hinata saw a side of Naruto she'd never really seen before. If anything happens to her, I'll have your head Sakura-chan. His eyes slid from blue to crimson and Sakura only smiled, her eyes closing as she put her arm on Hinata's shoulder, turning them both around. Hi Hokage-sama. She'll be in good hands. Hinata looked briefly over her shoulder to see he was gone, only a flutter of air and nothing more. For the next 3 hours Hinata was seated in a hard chair in Shikamaru Nara's office, recounting in heavy detail every last moment of her time before reaching this point. It was very emotional and several times she couldn't speak without crying, but a box of tissues was readily available and no one seemed to judge her otherwise. Sakura sat next to her, coaxing her along through the stories while Shikamaru questioned her with interest, obviously thinking deeply on the situation. After what seemed like ages, Hinata was finally done and Shikamaru was just thinking while Sakura inspected her fingernails. Quote. You said the last thing you physically did was activate your Byakugan, correct? Hinata looked up from the tissue she was balling in her hands and nodded. Yes, I think it must have been a reflex. He agreed silently. Yes, well, He yawned and Sakura glared at him. He covered his mouth and swallowed the tiredness, looking at them both with lidded dark eyes. Bloodline limits are tricky. Sadly, I don't have much experience in that field seeing as I'm not an Uchiha or a Hyuga, or whatnot, but there's someone who's very familiar with those. He leaned back in his chair, pushing his hands behind his head and Sakura's eyes narrowed. You know how Hiashi treats Hinata. Shikamaru opened one eye and rolled it, and Hinata perked up a bit, hands clenching the tissue ball between them. Everyone knows that woman. I meant Kakashi. He sat up and put a hand on the desk, standing up and stretching. If anyone has something to add to this, it's Kakashi. Didn't you say he could open that vortex thing or something? He should be an expert on weird by now. Sakura turned his words over. I suppose. But who says he's going to cooperate? Shikamaru chuckled. Woman, you need to get out of the hospital more. Kakashi Hatake does two things nowadays, drink sake and read. Naruto only makes him take 1 or 2 missions every month because he has get stir crazy and causes him trouble. Sakura smiled warmly. That's Kakashi for you. Well, thank you, we'll get right on that. Shikamaru nodded, waving his hand casually as Sakura helped Hinata up from her seat. She looked at Shikamaru and then at the door. The boy hadn't really changed much. He was still the most intelligent person she knew, and by far the sleepiest. She smiled a little. Maybe things weren't as different as she thought. Did you see that Hinata? Shikamaru was practically asleep. Hinata nodded shyly and walked closely to Sakura, who had traded her lab coat at the door and was now sporting a simple outfit of cherry red and beige. Hinata did not miss the large Uchiha symbol on her back, either, but somehow it seemed to fit. Hinata didn't bother to think about her own clothes or the white swirl that adorned them. In truth, she'd been somewhat happy with her wardrobe of simple fabrics and sensible cuts. She'd always been a modest girl, and even now she seemed to hold herself in a reserved, but attractive way. As for Shikamaru, he had seemed rather sleepy, sleepier than usual. Sakura noticed her questioning gaze and laughed loudly. Shikamaru married a Suna kunoichi named Temari about 3 years ago. For a long time no one thought they'd get married, they fought so much, but now it's easy to see they've been quite busy. Hinata blushed again at the last statement and Sakura chuckled lightly again. And here she'd thought Ino would always fall for the lazy ninja with a handsome smirk. And Ino-chan? She asked out loud, on the subject of the Shika Ino Cho formation. Sakura smiled lightly and turned to Hinata, her eyes sparkling. She and Chuji have been engaged for years. Seems Ino just can't accept marriage. She says it makes her feel like an old maid. Chuji seems perfectly fine with it, seeing as they really don't have much eyes for anyone else but each other. Sakura put her hands behind her back as they walked, people passing and going into shops like they had 5 years ago. Only it seemed that a little bit of tiredness had disappeared from everyone's eyes, like everyone was relieved or had taken a good breath recently, like everyone had a reason to be happy. Naruto is ag good Hokage, she said softly, remembering the protective way he'd stared at her, even though it was only Sakura. The girl smiled quietly, but Hinata could feel nothing but raw pride rolling off of her body. Hi, he's excellent. The best in all the ages, they say. She turned to Hinata and tilted her head, and no one is prouder than you. Hinata smiled a little. Yes, she thought, I would be. On the subject of you and Naruto, I'm assuming you've already discovered your marital status, of course. Hinata nodded somberly, deflating just a little. Yes, I found out this morning after they turned the shower on me. Sakura stopped walking. What? Hinata poked her fingers nervously together, feeling very much under the spotlight. Well, Naruto and SSSSSS. She found the name made her tongue thick. Sakura smirked. Sasuke. Hi. Sasuke-san used the shower to make me conscious again. Conscious? Did you faint? You haven't fainted in years. Hinata nodded again and Sakura began walking, sighing as she went. They're two of the biggest idiots in the world, no matter how old they get, to me at least. Hinata knew the kunoichi was just putting up a front though, her eyes were too happy to be sincere. Which made another question come to mind. Sakura-san, why you and Sasuke-san? Sakura blinked, coming out of her mind and tucked hair behind her head. Married for too long, which is really only 2 years. We also have a son, he's 17 months, his name's Hatsuharu. She smiled and her eyes took on a dreamy quality. He looks just like Sasuke, and he's so smart. She began to babble on about the boy and Hinata found herself smiling too as they walked. Sure, she was still rather rattled that Sakura and Sasuke had a child, but at the same time she could defiantly see that Sakura was probably the proudest mother in Konoha, although she probably was going to get strict as time went on. Smiling until her name broke her out of her temporary happiness. Hinata-chan. Hinata stopped, the hair on the back of her neck raising just a fraction. Sakura turned around with a short, and then her eyes softened. Ah, Neji, you look well. Arigato, Sakura-san. Hinata's eyes were wide like dinner plates. She'd forgotten her cousin. Her cousin. She rigidly turned around, but she was unable to stop herself from looking because her fear was ebbing away and quickly becoming a frantic curiosity. What she saw was quite startling, and Hinata's mouth fell open without much warning. She barely believed what she was seeing. The first thing Hinata really registered was Neji's face. And the smile that was glued to it. And not the smile he used at home to put her at ease, the smile that only pretended to be happy so maybe she'd have one less thing to worry about, but a true one that covered the smooth planes of his chin and cheeks. Or what used to be smooth, for now it seemed a long jagged scar ran from his forehead to his chin, a deep slash she knew had taken more than only days to heal. It made his left eye droop sleepily, and his face was no longer so coldly aristocratic. It was warmer now, if not pleasant. Neji had always had the face of a soldier, cold and impassive, but now with the scar he seemed an honored veteran who'd earned it as valiantly as she could ever have imagined. Other than the obvious blemish he was completely the same. His hair was still long and smooth, braided loosely behind his back to keep it away from his eyes and the bandages he still wore round his forehead to cover his seal. He was dressed in a lofty tunic belted at his waist and dark pants, various buckles and straps holding it together in a vague resemblance of his old ensemble. His eyes looked at her with a distant fondness, like she was the little sister of a very good friend. Only inches away from being his own, but still untouchable. And for some odd reason, Hinata did not look away from him as she normally did but stared directly into him, searching for the ultimate change in him that she could see without eyes. More surprising still was that she could not have thought him any other way but this one. He fits her perfectly, blending in around him with an ease she often tried to mimic, that she could not be as shocked as she'd really wanted to be. It was as if the very corners of her brain had pulled him into thin air saying, this is what he will look like, this is what he will be like. We know, and it had come true. Shishi. The voice was a whisper of violets on a field and Hinata's eyes were instantly pulled downwards at the sound, snapping her back to the present. It was a little boy looking at her very severely, tugging anxiously at Neji's sleeve and pointing at her as she stared. Huger eyes and a stern little face looked back at her. Tetsuya, you should be silent when your father is speaking. Hinata watched the odd display as Neji put a large hand on the boy's milk chocolate hair, stroking so softly she might not have noticed the movement of his hands. The boy's mouth closed and he stood, staring at Hinata, with those wide eyes, almost expectant in his stance. Neji pulled his eyes away from the boy, who looked so much like Neji it couldn't have been anyone but his son, and back to Hinata. How are you, Hinata? I feel like we haven't spoken for ages. Hinata shuddered at the thought as Neji's eyes probed hers, his hand still on his son's head, and she just blinked. Well. She kept staring at the child who was staring back, a queer look passing over his sharp little features as he opened his mouth again. You're not my aunt. Sakura stopped smiling and stared at the boy, who couldn't have been older than 4, and Neji stopped speaking to Hinata and looked down at his son severely. Tetsuya, that is no way to treat Hinata Haim. Do you hear? You are not to be so brash. The boy stared up at his father indigently and then raised one pale little hand. That isn't Hinata Haim. Hinata stared at his accusing little finger and blushed scarlet. Had he really seen through her that easily? Neji gave another cold look to his son and bowed his head towards Hinata. My apologies, Hinata. Tetsuya is at the age of speaking what's on his mind. If Hinata hadn't been so upset that she'd been found out by her 4-year-old nephew, she might have seen the tiny look of affection that pulled at Neji's mouth. But she was upset and found it rather hard to focus on a coherent thought as those scrutinizing eyes questioned her as violently as his little cunning voice did. Who are you? Why do you look like my aunt? Where is she? Bring her back. Sakura smiled sheepishly and stole a nervous look at the dumbstruck Hinata. She looked as if she were about to cry. Good grief, told off by a 4-year-old, she mumbled, putting a protective hand on her shoulder, attempting to wake her up from her stupor. Neji pinched Tetsuya's arm through his Chinese shirt and the boy yelped. That is enough, Tetsuya. Your mother and I will have to talk about this mouth of yours. The boy scowled and began to glare at the still quite frightened Hinata. Sakura ran a hand through her hair and bowed towards Neji briefly. Ah, it's quite all right. Hinata and I have an errand to run, maybe she can stop by later this week, she's been a little sick. She squeezed Hinata's shoulder sharply and Hinata gasped so loud she began to cough, air running every which way through her body. The Hyuga prodigy nodded solemnly and gave Hinata a soft look. Yes, Hinata Haim should take better care of herself. She's looking rather pale. Sakura smiled and gave a happy wave goodbye as the two disappeared within the crowds of people and then began to drag Hinata away from the spot she was glued, still coughing like a crazy person. She did not see the little boy look back at her with wide eyes, as if he'd known something she had not. By the time they had reached the apartment building, Hinata had gotten herself composed, slightly. She was still frazzled and Sakura only shook her head as they climbed the stairs to Kakashi's flat, her heels clicking on the wood and Hinata's own shoes making soft steps. Hinata could not seem to shake that very violated feeling she'd received looking at the creature that was her nephew. It was very discerning and Hinata could not help but feel like it was only the beginning of such a horrible sensation. But for the present, Hinata had familiar butterflies at seeing the daring shinobi she remembered as Kakashi. The one who did as he pleased and went where the wind took him, who looked after people and himself like a friendly old man. She was almost unhappy with her amount of faith that he could cure her, like it was a misinterpreted omen that she should be so eager. Is Kakashi-sensei are retired now? Hinata questioned as they went up yet another flight of stairs. Sakura laughed and shook her head between chuckles. Oh no, no. Kakashi's just slowed down enough to actually enjoy peace times. He's seen so many battles he feels like the world needs time to catch up with Kakashi. No, he's just taking a well-deserved vacation right now. They got off at a landing and Hinata followed Sakura as they wound through the hallways, passing doors and people as they went, mostly shinobi men she hadn't really ever seen before, but were being rather friendly. Ohio, Hinata Haim. How are you, Hinata Haim? Hinata Haim, tell your husband I need a raise. They smiled broad grins and laughed lightly as they passed her, shedding compliments and sweet looks that had Sakura rolling her eyes. Naruto's barely been Hokage a year and they've got you on a pedestal. They think you're the sweetest thing to ever walk the earth. She said loud enough for an unsuspecting teenager to hear. He flashed a glance at Hinata and blushed, making Hinata dizzy with too much attention. Oh dear, she mumbled, almost running into the now stationary Sakura's back as they stood in front of a painted blue door. If one of them ever dared say that to me I'd knock him out so fast. Sakura continued, and Hinata pressed her fingers together nervously. They seemed nice. Only because they know your husband would cut their heads off if they so much as looked at you wrong, Hinata. Both women whirled around to see a very lax-looking Kakashi standing behind them, looking not a day older than when Hinata had last seen him and still just as slick to have followed them silently along to his own door. He also seemed to be holding what looked like some groceries, a celery stick jutting from the top like a flag as they stood in the crowded little hall. Sakura looked displeased and moved aside, allowing the seasoned man to unlock the door, and Hinata only continued to blush perpetually. She seemed to be doing it so much she was surprised her nose hadn't started to bleed, and when the door swung open they all proceeded into the small, but clean apartment. It was rather sparse, but furnished with very strange little knickknacks and oddities from all over the ninja countries, figurines and mismatched tables and chairs in corners and a large hand-woven wool rug sprawled out in the middle of the floor. Hinata admired all of them silently, drinking in the deep hues and forms of each one's unique appearance before wandering after the other two into the kitchen where Sakura was complaining passionately about Sasuke to Kakashi, who was putting away groceries with a lazy sort of grace. And then he tells me, I'll be back at 10. You could have at least phoned to tell me you'd all three gone out drinking like a couple of idiots. Hinata stood awkwardly in the midst of their conversation, feeling rather like a person left out of a very funny inside joke. I know you're not here to just talk, so why don't you tell me what you two are doing here when it's my reading day? He said in a slow drawl, the lips beneath his mask moving slightly as he closed a last cupboard and faced the two kunoichi with looks of meager irritation. Sakura glared at her former sensei and then sighed, beckoning to Hinata, who shuffled shyly forward and looked at the tiles of Kakashi's kitchen. Take a look and tell me what you see, Sakura said seriously, making Hinata lift her head and stare at the hypnotizing gray eye before letting her own pale ones dart back to the floor. I see a very embarrassed Hinata, he replied matter-of-factly, leaning against a counter with his arms crossed, still inspecting her. One I haven't seen in a while, might I add. Sakura sighed again. Exactly. Hinata looked at Sakura this time, who was still staring at Kakashi, who was still staring at her. She woke up this morning with no recollection of the past 5 years and a rather interesting story as to why. A slender silver eyebrow moved in curiosity. Care to explain? Sakura nodded and proceeded to retell the detailed occurrences, paying special attention to the location, time of day and what had happened to Naruto. After a few minutes, Kakashi nodded and then stared at Hinata thoughtfully. You say you were using your Byakugan moments before this all happened, correct? Hinata nodded shyly and Kakashi shrugged. I really don't know exactly, but if I had to bet, chakra deprivation seems to be the culprit. It does strange things to bloodlines like Sharingan and Byakugan. If I had to explain it better, it would be like running a machine with no gas, but the machine keeps going and doing what's told, making it malfunction and backfire. It's like the gears are moving, but they rub each other the wrong way and end up doing what they think is right but really isn't. Understand? Hinata nodded fearfully. Why yes B but T that M means. Kakashi nodded. If what you're saying is true, and I believe it is, then the chances of you getting back to normal are unpredictable, if not never going to happen. You may go back in a month, you may in 10 years. We have no way of telling if you'll even go back at all. Overall, it seems as if your Byakugan was pushed into seeing too far ahead as a result of stress and nothing left to keep it working properly. It was a violent reaction to keep you from D-S. The word sounded strange. Hinata had never really been S before. She stopped shaking and stared at the spot beside Kakashi's left arm, just over his shoulder. Had she been so consumed with Naruto she hadn't even considered her own well-being. She had been S. Of course, Hinata. You were bleeding to death. Hinata didn't turn when Hinata made the remark plainly. I guess I didn't notice. Hinata said again, looking up with a soft smile. Well, at least I'm surrounded by people I know. Sakura nodded surely, and even though Kakashi also agreed, he wasn't completely convinced that Hinata was as at ease as she let on. There was a depth of sadness to her eyes that he couldn't get out of his mind. Sakura, however, took the slight uplifted attitude and ran with it. Yes, that's right, Hinata, you're surrounded people who still care about you regardless of your age. Sure, a lot of things might be different, and yes, you are married to Naruto, but you'll have nothing but support. Hinata let a little air out of her nose in a quiet laugh. Ah, thank you, Sakura-san. Kakashi looked at her oddly and scratched his ear. If I were to guess, the 22-year-old Hinata is in you somewhere. The longer you stay here, the easier things should become. I wouldn't be surprised if you started remembering things within the next month or so. Sakura smiled again, even wider. Hear that, Hinata? It's all going to get sorted out. Hinata nodded. She wasn't unconvinced, but something told her that things ran deeper than anyone might have imagined them to be, and that in this process she may just lose herself entirely. She couldn't shake it, just like she still couldn't get Tetsuya's eyes out of her head. The remainder of time was spent talking slowly, further evaluating at Kakashi's small table over tea. Mostly just little details taken into consideration, and also the reiteration of Naruto's state at the time. If he was S then, why is he alive now? Sakura had asked, leaning her hand on her shoulder. Kakashi had given an intelligent smile beneath his mask. Who knows? Any number of things may have occurred. For Hinata, this may be one of thousands of possible futures. Or maybe a possible past. Sakura mused, biting the edge of her nail. Hinata was close to boiling over with information at this point and opted for a more tranquil state of twisting her glass between her hands. She was trying not to think about anything in particular, but Naruto's face kept appearing every time. Naruto. She sighed heavily and took a sip of her tea, an action that did not go unnoticed. It's getting late, Naruto should be home about now. Kakashi said vaguely, looking at the clock and then at Hinata, who did not really react, only paled a little more. Sakura stopped her thinking and sat up. I hadn't meant for us to stay so long, Kakashi. Great, now I'll have to work in Hinata's tests tomorrow. Kakashi shrugged. No harm done. But as for your medical endeavors, it is my duty as Naruto's former sensei to make sure his property is kept in good state. I wouldn't do anything out of the ordinary if I were you. This all seems to be rather believable if you just talk to Hinata, and I'm sure Naruto won't want any further stress inflicted on her. He watched the look of gratitude cross Hinata's features at the prospect of some relief, and continued, smiling through his voice, if I were Hinata I would stay inside all day and do nothing tomorrow. Sakura's face softened and she looked at Hinata's face, which was now starting to protest. Oh no, I see, couldn't. I'm not used to doing nothing. Sakura laughed. Consider it doctor's orders. Hinata smiled, defeated, and tiredly sipped her tea. It seemed she no longer had much say in just about anything at all anymore. Are you sure you don't want me to get Naruto away for a bit? He's going to hound you something awful as soon as you walk in. Hinata shook her head from side to side, standing in front of the foreign house with huge spreads of flowers covering the lawn. Sakura had been very accommodating in her endeavors to make Hinata's life easier thus far, but asking the Hokage to leave his house was just one thing Hinata would not allow. Sakura blinked and nodded soundly. Hi. If you need anything just call me. My number's got to be in that house somewhere. Hinata nodded again, too weary to reply, and watched the pink-haired Kunoichi walk down the path with a small wave. She followed the doctor with her eyes all the way down the road where the low walls met the main street. A figure was standing near a bench in the distance, and as she approached she held out her arms. Sasuke neatly passed a squirming boy to her. Hinata felt the stir in her heart. Suddenly, the air smelled like milk and sugar, and the breeze whispering through a tall cherry tree near the house corner sounded like laughter. She looked at the door to the house. The house shared with Naruto Uzumaki as of this morning. 5 years was such an awfully long time, but she had to begin somewhere. A light flickered on in the bedroom she recognized from this morning. Beat, beat, thump, thump, thump. Her heart was beginning to hammer. 5 years, starting with one night alone with the one person she'd loved for a million years. She thought of all the questions she'd patiently saved in her head. There were hundreds of them, and she'd saved them all for now. I'm horrible, she whispered to the quiet dusk. I'm so selfish to ask so much of him now. It's like taking advantage. It was true. She was being horribly selfish because with the realization of her death came the realization that Naruto was hers in this place. She would get to be alone with him, talk with him, maybe even, she blushed. Don't even think about that. She reprimanded herself, dispelling the image of Naruto without his shirt, beneath her body. In truth she wanted him to make everything all right, to make everything better, and answer all her questions. She may be so nervous she might faint, but she would try. She would try very hard and make the feeling last. Ha ha. Hinata is allowed to be 17, isn't she? She was never going to forget anything after this. She would again before she forgot what it was like being married to Naruto Uzumaki. And she was going to get the story from his mouth, no one else's. He would tell her about them. She would start tonight with easy things and build up. She was not going to rush this like a silly little girl, oh no. She was going to make it last, even if it killed her. And her reason behind this sudden change of attitude in an otherwise hopelessly cowardice heroine. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.